Now that we've discussed neurotransmitters, this video will discuss other types of signaling molecules and explain what produces hormones. So by the end, you should understand the difference between a neurotransmitter and a hormone. So neuropeptides are just a little different than your typical neurotransmitter. They're also known as neuromodulators. And so what this means is that it modulates or alters the activity of another neurochemical. So in order to be released, they require repeated stimulation. And again, they're going to alter or modulate the activity of other neurotransmitters. Now, because of this, they might not stay right there in that synaptic area. They might diffuse away from the synapse and go to surrounding areas or to another synapse to have this modulatory effect. They're often released from dendrites or the cell body. So this isn't your typical type of axon terminal releasing a neuropeptide. Sometimes the dendrites of the cell body will release it, and this might go back up into that axon terminal area to have that modulatory effect. They can also sometimes signal other neurons to release the same neuropeptide, so getting neurons in adjacent areas to synchronize their activity. Hormones are another type of neurochemical that are important in the nervous system, and a hormone is a chemical that's secreted by a gland or another cell that's transported in the bloodstream. So the idea is, remember with the neurotransmitter, we had our presynaptic neuron and we had our postsynaptic neuron, and that synaptic cleft was a really small space. So when that neurotransmitter was released, it crossed the synapse, diffusing to the receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Very small, very tiny little space that it had to travel. Hormones, on the other hand, are released into the bloodstream, and hormones can be released from the pituitary gland in the brain and travel all the way down to our ovaries. And that's quite a big distance. And so they do that by entering the bloodstream. And so that's the difference, is that hormones travel a great distance while neurotransmitters kind of stay in their own little specific region. And we already have discussed how certain neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and epinephrine can also act as hormones. So these glands that secrete the hormones are called endocrine glands. And so that's where these hormones are produced. The endocrine glands are endocrine organs. And so they're responsible for the production of the hormones. And hormones are important for triggering long-lasting changes in multiple parts of the body. So when we come back and we talk about reproduction, we'll see that hormones can produce long-lasting effects as well as temporary effects. So this diagram is just showing you some of the different endocrine glands or endocrine organs in the body. So some of the ones that we'll talk about this semester is the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, which both produce and release hormones. The pineal gland will become important. We won't really talk about any of these. We will talk about the adrenal glands and their role in producing stress hormones. We'll talk about the ovaries in females and the testes in males, and their role of producing important hormones as well. So the pituitary gland is one that we're going to come back and talk about kind of in layers. So I believe this is the first time that we're talking about it. And here, this is just showing you, here's a diagram of the brain, and we'll go into more detail on this in the anatomy chapter. But here's the thalamus in the center of the brain. Right below that is our hypothalamus, and then kind of dangling off the end is the pituitary gland. Now this pituitary gland is very important as it's thought to control all the other endocrine glands. Now it's a little tricky because the hypothalamus ultimately controls the pituitary gland, but there's a lot of crosstalk between the two. So as you see here, the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus. It kind of dangles down below the hypothalamus. And it consists of two distinct glands. So there's an anterior pituitary and a posterior, and they are very distinct glands that produce their own set of hormones. The anterior pituitary synthesizes its own hormones. So the anterior pituitary, the one in the front, produces its own hormones, and that produces 6 hormones. We'll learn more about those later on. And the release of these hormones is controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls the release of the hormones in the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. The hypothalamus produces those hormones and sends them to the posterior pituitary when it's time to be released. So it's considered an extension of the hypothalamus. And again, the hypothalamus synthesizes those hormones, which then are transported into that posterior pituitary. So we'll come back and talk about the pituitary gland a little bit more in the anatomy chapter, and then again when we talk about reproduction.